Chop chop chop. We need to be quick, as you see for yourselves. My apartment is right next to the nuclear testing grounds, right across my backyard, so I only have approximately 12 minutes before the blast reaches me. Now, what we have for today is talking about the balance tuning, but of a different kind. The first kind was the one focused on specs, in particular the changes to Holy Priest, and then for today we have the planned changes for the, I am sure, beloved Season 4 pool of dungeons, which is going to be the original 8 dungeons of Dragonflight. Now, before we even go and talk about these dungeons changing, we have to point out that at the moment, worryingly, we can say this, we are already in Doomer mode. Worryingly, we do not see any Fated Affix, which seems like a bold move, considering this is supposed to be a fated season, to not have a Fated Affix for Mythic Plus, but only have one for the raid. So we still have to wait though, we're not too sure. Remember also before we start that the majority, or rather all of these dungeons are going to be reintroduced as we left them. So all of the 32 nerfs to Ruby Life pools and the 14 nerfs to Nokhud Offensive and the 33 changes to Azure Vaults are going to be already in place as the dungeons launch again their Mythic Plus version in Season 4. First of the changes, we start off on a bad foot, the Burning Chains, this very intrusive mechanic that pretty much rules all of your trash pools in the dungeon, now have been changed. They now stun enemies for 5 seconds instead of 1.5, but they no longer do damage. Instead, they increase your damage done, or the damage taken of the mobs, by 50% for the duration of the stun. Now, it is very unlikely that this 50% damage buff for 5 seconds will be able to emulate the 3 million DPS you would have been able to do if you were using the chains from the original versions before the nerfs. So this might actually change quite a lot in the routing of Neltharus, mostly due to the routing being essentially a flip-flop between let's have a big pool with all of our cooldowns, and then we have a big pool with the chains, and then we have a pool with our cooldowns, a pool with the chains, and you can alternate these kind of pools. Now with this change it will be much less possible to make happen in Mythic Plus. The second kind of change, this one is more understandable. It looks bad at first. Fiery Focus, the charge of Chargath that you have to interrupt with the chains, now does high damage to the tank every second until the cast ends. Now this though comes at the benefit of having the deadly circle in the middle being removed. You know, the deadly circle that very often killed your DPS and killed your healers as they tried to run next to the boss with the chains. Now this is gone, and the one who has to pay for it is the tank, who now has to take actual heavy damage from the ability itself. But you no longer have to worry about the deadly mechanic, which is a net positive. It's a net win overall. The tank can just handle himself with his own defensives. The boss doesn't really do that much heavy damage otherwise, so it's a good change for the boss. Talking about good changes, Sarga has a couple of positive changes. Dragon's Eruption, the radius of the lava has been reduced, but that's not what matters. What matters is the Curse of the Dragon Horde. This is the curse you get when you pick up the treasure that you need to use to break the magma shield. Now it lasts only for 30 seconds. It does say now it can stack, but that's not a problem. Magma shield has a 45-second cooldown, and this debuff lasts for 30 seconds. So unless you are a kleptomaniac who just cannot help picking up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 fucking gold coins on the ground and get yourself 5 stacks of this debuff, you're fine. You just pick up the treasure, use it on the shield, and by the time the next shield is up and you have picked up the treasure again, the debuff will have expired. So it's positive overall, and even more positive for the groups that don't have a Curse Dispel available for them. Now you avoid completely any risk of a high tyrannical fight where a player without a Curse Dispel was just going to get 3, 4, or 5 stacks of this debuff. Now this problem is gone. Azure Vaults has a pretty decent start. When it comes to trash, you have the erratic growth cast time increase from 2 to 3 seconds, so now it's much less deadly. To be fair, the 3 ends in the first few packs of the dungeon were not exactly the hardest part of the trash of Azure Vault, so It's not that big of a deal. Slightly annoying that the Draconic Breaker's Shoulder Slam now has been made more problematic. Now, it's not just a one target hit, now it's actually hitting all players within 8 yards, so you have to be careful about managing it. On top of that now, it ignores line of sight. So there is no escaping that charge. And on top of that, once you get hit, you take 10% more physical damage for 10 seconds. That's perhaps one of the more dangerous parts of the changes. You have Azure Blade and the AoE being nerfed in damage because now it ticks for damage every 2.5 seconds instead of every 2 seconds. So less deadly intermission on Azure Blade. Umbral Skull has an extra added mechanic to make sure you don't ignore this crystal. The big crystal that spawns from Umbral Skull now also pulses AoE damage until you break the shield, the absorb shield that's on the crystal. So you can't just go and ignore the crystal. Not that you wanted to ignore it in the first place, but just to make sure people have it right, you have to focus the crystals during Umbral Skull. The result is a mixed bag for Algethar Academy. We have some pretty decent changes, like the changes to the trash, the unruly textbook, monotonous lecture, which is the stun, the disorient. Now it takes 3 seconds to cast instead of 2, which is very good. Mystic Blast is nerfed by 40%. This is not the right type of changes because this was the must interrupt ability of the trash pack. So why would you nerf it by 40%? If you let this one go through, you deserve to wipe, you deserve to have your entire party be killed. It's much better to, for example, increase the cast time of Mystic Blast, reduce the HP of the Scepter, for example. Those are better nerfs than just nerfing the damage taken by 40%. Chances are, if you are in a plus 28 fortified and you let this one go off, you're gonna die, even if it's nerfed by 40%. Meanwhile, we can see the correct kind of nerf for the Corrupted Mana Fiend's Surge spam, which is increased by half a second. This is good, because at very high keys, the Surge spam starts hitting for like 60 or 70% of your max health, so getting the cast time be slowed down, it's a positive change for these trash packs. We have tanks rejoicing now because Kroth has Savage Peck initial damage reduced by 13.3% and the dot damage reduced by 1/3. So Blizzard already anticipating the high Mythic Plus level scaling danger of this mob coming back. Weird that the Echo of Doragoza actually gets a brand new mechanic. The Echo of Doragoza unleashes a powerful arcane energy inflicting tons of damage to all players and opening up arcane rifts in nearby locations. Now, this is putting more stress, of course, on the healer. The fight itself doesn't have a lot of requirements in terms of healing, so Blizzard thought, we have to give them something to do. Let's give them some just AoE every once in a while to require more focus from your healer. What might make this quite dangerous, though, is the space. The space in your room in the boss fight. The boss fight drags on quite a lot on Tyrannical, and it can start to get quite tricky with all of the arcane rifts circles spawning and then the ensuing bullet hell that is formed from these arcane rifts. Now you have an extra mechanic that spawns more arcane rifts, and from the tooltip it even says opening arcane rift in nearby locations. So maybe it's multiple arcane rifts every time there is a cast of this mechanic. So if you're starting to take, 5 minutes to deal with this boss and you end up having 5, 6, 7, 8 more of these rifts in the room, it can start to become quite the dangerous type of boss, which is unlucky because this was supposed to be the joke boss at the end of Algethar Academy. You just got through 3 not very easy bosses, one after the other. You finally get your reward of dealing with this boss. This might make it a little bit more tricky. Nokhud Offensive. Nokhud Offensive was one of the most nerfed dungeons, especially when it came to trash mobs, and it's interesting to see that now we have a mixed bag once more. Because you have some of these changes being mostly irrelevant because they were either from mobs that you were not pulling, mobs that were completely outside of your route, like the Thunder Fist's Deadly Thunder now having its cast time reduced from 6 to 3 seconds. You have the Angry Fucking Bird, very dangerous Angry Fucking Bird, nerfed by a bunch. The damage increase now it's 150% instead of 200. However, that's it. After this we have buffs, because you have the Death Bolt, the very dangerous Death Bolt, getting 50% increase more damage at the cost of being half a second longer. So you have more leeway to interrupt the ability, but if you fail the interrupt, now it's really bad. In fortified keys, this 50% buff is going to start one-shotting people very early on. Then you have the Desecrating Roar. Why not? Now it summons 5 dogs instead of 3. To make it still kind of bad for the tanks, you have another hurtful change. You have the Sundering Slash from the Beast Callers, who used to put a very dangerous 20-second long 20% physical damage taken debuff on your tank. Now it's all damage taken debuff. So now it's not just physical, it's also magical damage taken. Yes, the biggest danger to a tank in these pools is still the physical damage taken, but, you know, adding on top of that now the extra 20% magical is not gonna be too nice for a tank around the third boss area where basically all of these mobs are getting buffed. It's gonna be quite nasty again when it comes to Nokhud Offensive's trash mobs. Interestingly, none of the bosses of Nokhud Offensive have been touched at all. Yeah, I have doubts on that. Then we have Uldaman. Again, Uldaman, interestingly, receives no changes. You have the Fiery Surge of the Lost Vikings getting reduced by 50%, whatever. You don't even know what it is. I don't even know what it is. Nobody cares. That wasn't the problem of the dungeon. Where is the bleed of the third boss being nerfed, for example? Nobody knows. It's not in here. Then you have Halls of Infusion. Well, you were expecting more in Halls of Infusion. Way more changes in Halls of Infusion. At least, though, if there is one good thing that we really wished, was the Containment Apparatus AIDS Beam. Now it's being nerfed in damage by 41%. Thank God, at least we have this nerf. No nerfs to bosses, no nerfs to the trash later on of Halls of Infusion. That's for now all there is when it comes to dungeon changes of halls. Interestingly, one of the most changed dungeons, in fact the most changed dungeon of the day, is Brackenhide Hollow. Many of the changes are nerfs, even though, again, some of these nerfs don't touch mobs you were supposed to be pulling before in the first place, like the Bone Bolt Hunter, basically the ninja pull pack. Yeah, the guy with the dogs that you can ninja pull when you're trying to go to the third boss and someone picks it up and then you take a ton of damage from this Bone Bolt and this dot it puts on players, right? It's getting giga nerfed. The damage is cut by a third, and the dot left behind is cut in duration by half. You're not supposed to pull this, but maybe, now with this massive nerf, it's worth again. Who knows? Similar nerfs to the Rotable Stalker's Bone Bolt Volley, now taking 5 seconds to cast instead of 2. Another good quality of life, the Decaying Roots cast of the Decayed Elder, which is something you do pull quite often, is getting increased. 3.5 seconds to cast the Mass Roots instead of 2.5. This is good. The root themselves are not that dangerous in terms of damage, in terms of the punishment from the root themselves. Of course, the danger comes in having to stand still and being rooted. So, more leeway for your interrupts to stop this ability. Also, another beautiful quality of life, the Rot Hexer's Decay Totem's Withering. Now it's a flat 2% haste debuff. That's it. It doesn't touch the movement, it doesn't stack up to 10 times, cutting your damage by like a third, slowing your movement down to a crawl, none of that. It's just a 2% haste debuff right now, which is a very good quality of life change. Also, one of the biggest nerfs to a boss we are seeing, and definitely the biggest nerfs we are seeing today, is to the first boss of Brackenhide. The first boss of Brackenhide, which used to be a joke of a boss, people were kind of just breezing through the boss early on in the season, and then they started going higher in tyrannical keys and realized, hold on a second, this Gush Frenzy and this Mark for Butchery thing are really, really deadly. So Blizzard now is adjusting for them coming back in Season 4. Now Gush Frenzy, the dot left behind by the ability, is lasting 15 seconds instead of 45. Number 2, Marked for Butchery does half as much damage as before. Now it ticks every second instead of every half second. And then the Predatory Instincts, the haste stacking buff they get on themselves, is now 5% instead of 10%. So significant nerf to Brackenhide Hollow, in particular to the first boss. There is also a nerf to the last boss, the Catriarch Rathai, which is the Withering Rot, ticking damage nerfed by 17%. Again, this is one of the nerfs which is like, well, you're not supposed to be hit by Withering Rot. So, okay, fine, I'm taking less damage, but in a perfect world, this was never going to matter because you didn't get hit by the moving cloud, right? Because you're a good player. The last one of the changes goes to Ruby Life Pools, and again, irrelevant set of nerfs to the Tempest channelers that are in the borders of the circle upstairs. These are the typical ninja pool mobs. That's basically the only times you might have seen them in combat. Now they do half as much damage as before. Okay, the real good change is the change in the Inferno core of the last boss of Ruby Life Pools. Now, the damage stays the same, but it's now spread over 4 seconds instead of 3. This is good. This is another help to squishy specs to survive, because over 4 seconds you have more time, you have more global cooldowns, the healer has more window to just top players off, instead of having a much shorter reaction time for this mechanic on the last boss of this dungeon, which becomes very deadly. Now, as we have gone through the entire list, of course, a bunch of questions will start popping up. Where are the nerfs? Where are the heavy nerfs to some of the more dangerous bosses in particular? We're not seeing many changes, for example, many nerfs to the bosses in Neltharus. We have seen practically 0 changes to the bosses of Nokhud. Same goes for the bosses of Halls of Infusion, as well as the bosses of Ruby Life Pools, the first and the second boss of Ruby Life Pools as well. None of the trash of many of the other dungeons. So let's just say that for the first iteration it's passable, but we're gonna be needing some more robust quality of life to get people to be excited about this dungeon pool again. Not to mention the Fated Affix. I consider this entire season much more dead on arrival if Blizzard intends to launch Season 4 without even a spicy affix coming back in the season. You know, some spicy damage boost coming up in Mythic Plus to make things a bit more different. Because right now it's looking a bit too much doom and gloom when it comes to these dungeons, and even these changes are not particularly encouraging. They are all right at best. So these are the planned changes so far, at least in this first, I guess, round of the data-mined PTR version of Season 4. With this out of the way, we're now leaving each other on this Wednesday, beginning of the reset day in EU as well. With this out of the way, thank you guys, of course, for watching, together with everyone who is supporting, of course, through Patreon, and all the others who are doing it completely for free. Like, for example, liking and commenting down below, or subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, as per yesterday's messed up sleep schedule, now I am awake at 10 in the morning. I haven't been awake at 10 in the morning in like 3 years.